So, back in 1973, Canada's highest court gets this case, and it's a big one. It wasn't just about some obscure law. No, this case forced them to stare down a huge, fundamental question. What does fairness actually mean?
And really, when you strip everything else away, the whole thing came down to this one question. It's so simple, but so powerful. And get this, it was a question that would literally split the Supreme Court right down the middle.
All right, so let's get into it. The law at the center of all this, it was just a single clause, but it was buried inside a really powerful piece of legislation called the Indian Act. And this wasn't some new rule either. We're talking about a section that had been on the books in one form or another for about 100 years.
So here's how the rule worked, and it's pretty stark. It was all about who you married, and it was totally different depending on your sex. Okay, so if you were an Indian man and you married a non-Indian woman, no problem. You kept your Indian status, your wife could even gain status. But if you were an Indian woman and you married a non-Indian man, the consequences were, frankly, devastating. You were automatically stripped of your Indian status. And not just you, your children lost their status too.
Now, you can probably guess this law didn't just sit there on the books without a fight. Two women decided to challenge it, to fight back, and they had what they thought were two things on their side: a pretty new legal tool and a recent court victory that, well, it gave them hope that the path was already paved for them.
And it's so important to remember, these weren't just names in a court filing. These were real people with real lives at stake. You have Jeanette Lavell, who was literally told she no longer officially belonged to her own community. And then there's Yvonne Bedard. After her marriage ended, she tried to move back home, to her mother's house on the reserve, a home she had inherited. And the band council told her she had to leave. I mean, can you imagine? For them, the stakes just couldn't have been any higher.
So what was this legal weapon they were using? It was the 1960 Canadian Bill of Rights. This was a pretty big deal at the time, a new kind of law that was supposed to protect the fundamental freedoms of all Canadians. And it specifically said that those rights existed for everyone without discrimination based on sex.
Okay, so you really have to understand the timeline here to see why they felt they had a shot. You've got this rule that's been around forever, almost 100 years. Then, bam, 1960, the Bill of Rights comes along. And then, and this is the really crucial part, just a few years before their case, there was this landmark decision called the Drybones case. In that case, the Supreme Court used the exact same Bill of Rights to strike down a different part of the Indian Act, one that discriminated based on race. So you can see why Lavell and Bedard would be feeling pretty optimistic, right? There was a precedent.
So the case makes its way all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the 9 justices, they find themselves really struggling with something fundamental. They're wrestling with two totally different competing ideas about what the word equality even means when you're talking about the law.
Yeah, that was the big question. Right in front of them, what does equality before the law actually mean? Does it mean the words of the law, its content, have to treat everyone the same? Or does it just mean that whatever the law says, it gets applied equally to the specific group of people it's aimed at?
So on one side of the argument, you had 4 of the 9 justices. Their view was pretty clear. For them, equality before the law means the law itself can't be the source of inequality. If you have a law that, just by reading it, you can see it treats men and women differently, well, that's it. It's unequal. End of story.
And Justice Laskin, in his dissenting opinion, just lays it out so clearly. He basically says, hang on a second. We just dealt with this in the Drybones case for racial discrimination. How on earth can we turn around and say that discrimination based on sex is somehow different? For him, it was a no-brainer. Logically, you have to treat them the same way.
But then you have the other 5 justices, the majority, and they had a completely different take. For them, equality before the law wasn't about the content of the law, it was about the process. It just meant that the law, whatever it says, has to be applied and enforced the same way for everyone inside the group it targets.
And Justice Ritchie, who wrote the decision for the majority, he made this exact point. He basically said, look, this specific rule, Section 12(1)b, it's applied to all Indian women who marry non-Indians, no exceptions. So in that sense, it's being applied equally. The fact that the rule itself was different for men and women, that wasn't the legal issue for them. It was all about consistent application.
All right, so you've got the court totally split. 2 powerful, completely opposite ideas about what equality even is. The stage is set, and the moment finally comes for the verdict.
And the final vote count? 5-4. I mean, just think about that. A single vote decided it. An absolutely razor-thin margin on a question that gets to the very heart of what individual rights mean in Canada.
And so the bottom line is they lost. The majority of the Supreme Court went with that narrower definition of equality, which meant the law, the one that stripped Indigenous women of their status, was upheld. It was allowed to stand.
So why? What was their reasoning? Well, it came down to a few things. First, they pointed out that the Constitution gives Parliament this special power to make laws specifically about Indians and lands reserved for Indians. They said this case wasn't like Drybones, which was about a criminal offense. No, this was about defining membership, who belongs to the community. And in their opinion, the idea of equality didn't mean Parliament couldn't make these kinds of specific, different rules as part of that duty.
But here's where the story takes a really fascinating turn, because it doesn't end with that loss in court. In fact, in a really strange twist of history, this huge legal defeat actually ended up becoming one of the most important moments for advancing equality rights in Canada. It sparked a movement that would, seriously, change the country forever.
The reaction to that 5-4 decision was immediate and it was intense. People were outraged. A lot of people saw this ruling as a massive step backwards. And that outrage, it did something really important. It lit a fire under a whole generation of Indigenous women and their allies who just flat out refused to accept this as the final word.
And you can trace the impact for decades. First, the fight just moved out of the courtroom and into the political arena. Second, the case basically proved to everyone, very publicly, that the 1960 Bill of Rights just wasn't strong enough. It had failed this major test. And so, a few years later, when Canada was in the process of creating a brand new constitution, you better believe the memory of the Lavell case was top of mind for everyone involved. It directly influenced the creation of the much stronger, much more powerful equality rights that we now have in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
So, in the end, this case leaves us with this huge, complicated question that we're still debating today. What's more important, having universal rules that apply the same way to absolutely everyone, or having special rules that are designed to protect unique communities? It forces us to think about where we draw that line. And it's a massive legal and philosophical question that all started with two women who, at the end of the day, just wanted the right to go home.